Welcome to another podcast from the Politics Shed, which supports the work of the Politics Shed website, where you'll find many resources to support the subject, or if you're interested in politics, to find out more. In this episode, Socialism Part 2, from Marx to the present day. In their 1848 work, The Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels offered a scathing critique of contemporary thinkers, significantly shaping the future of socialism. Their core argument was that the creation of a utopia is unattainable. In a society still plagued by poverty, where the bourgeoisie not only control the means of producing material goods, but also dominate the production of ideas. They asserted that in every era the prevailing ideas are those of the ruling class. Therefore, only the complete transformation of society was sustainable. Marx and Engels believed that merely desiring a society founded on equality and justice was insufficient. They recognized that to effect change, one must first comprehend the world, particularly capitalism, its origins, structure, and trajectory. This understanding laid the groundwork for what is now known as Marxism, which some consider to be the first ideology deserving of that label. Karl Marx, a German educated at the University of Berlin, was influenced by many prominent intellectuals of his time. During his studies, he attended lectures by Hegel, a renowned philosopher whose idealist views saw history as driven by progress of the mind or ideas, which he termed the Geist. Hegel's philosophy resonated deeply during a period marked by the rise of socialist movements. Marx dedicated approximately 20 years to examining Hegel's ideas, famously aiming to reinterpret them by inverting the idealistic dialectic into a materialistic one. He proposed that material conditions shape ideas, rather than the reverse, asserting that man is a product of society, rather than society being a product of man. In this regard, Marx followed the philosophical lead of Ludwig Feuerbach. This is one of the key tenets of socialism, that man is the product of society. A central idea of Hegel's philosophy is alienation, which argues that individuals feel disconnected from their true nature, leading to unhappiness and discomfort. To rediscover ourselves, we seek knowledge. Marx adopted this concept and applied it to economics, concluding that alienation arises from our experiences as workers. He argued that our labour oppresses and alienates us, exemplified by de-skilling of workers in industrial processes and the appropriation of the value of our labour, which he termed surplus value. Capitalism steals the value of labour in the form of profits, which enrich the bourgeoisie and not the proletariat, which was Marx's term for the industrial working class. In a capitalist system, the market determines value through supply and demand. However, Marx contended that true value is rooted in the amount of labour invested in a product. For instance, if it takes 10 hours of labour to create an item, its value should reflect that time. This principle is known as the labour theory of value. According to Marx, the flaw in capitalism lies in its generation of surplus value or profit beyond the true cost of labour. Workers find themselves in an intolerable position, which can be described as exploitation. This alienation not only affects our relationship with our jobs, but also with others and our environment. It leads to crime, alcoholism, mental illness, and misdirected violence, which Marx observed as prevalent in Victorian London. In response, those who control the means of production, the capitalist class, resort to increasing physical oppression, through police, military, security forces, and increasing surveillance. Marx believed capitalism would dominate the realm of ideas and generate a false consciousness, such as beliefs in patriotism, xenophobia. These ideas divided the workers of the world and set them one against another. He also identified religion as a response to alienation. He suggested that in a harsh world, we project our hopes for a better life onto the afterlife, coining the phrase opium of the masses to describe religion. Today we might attribute a similar role to the media and advertising as generators of false consciousness and distraction. Marx argued that to overcome alienation, we must transform the economy, as it's the root cause of our feelings of disconnection. He asserted that mere interpretation of the world is inadequate, as are limited utopian experiments. Instead, we must strive for change. This comprehensive, revolutionary idea for the transformation of society set him apart from the utopians that came before. A distinction is often made between early and later Marx. Around the midpoint of his career, his ideas began to shift. While the concept of alienation remained, he dedicated himself to understanding capitalism. Living in exile in London, he spent considerable time in the British Museum Library, seeking to comprehend how capitalism functions and has developed, believing that this understanding could resolve societal problems. From his analysis of capitalism, described in his great work Das Kapital, or Capitalism, Marx identified significant trends in its development. He observed that over time it would become increasingly challenging for capitalists to extract surplus value, necessitating greater exploitation and repression. While society as a whole may accumulate wealth, the conditions for workers would deteriorate, potentially inciting a revolutionary movement. Marx was also influenced by Hegel in his concept of historical materialism, which supports his view that the economic system of capitalism is the root cause of societal development. This understanding is crucial, as it outlines how socialism can be achieved. Unlike earlier utopian thinkers who believed socialism could be realized through mere desire, Marx argued that capitalism creates the necessity for economic change. Capitalism generates wealth, which socialism and communism will eventually harness, transitioning directly from a feudal or impoverished society to communism is unfeasible. Instead, a gradual evolution through capitalism is essential. In the Communist Manifesto published in 1848, Marx and Engels provide a comprehensive analysis that parallels what we now understand as globalization. They illustrate how the bourgeoisie, the central figures in the manifesto, are transforming the world through advancements in communication and transportation, thereby unifying global experiences. For socialism and communism to materialize, a transitional phase through capitalism is essential, which again distinguishes Marx's perspective from the utopian idealists. Marx viewed class struggle as the driving force of history, contrasting Hegel's mystical notion of the Geist. This materialist approach leads him to argue that human history is defined by class conflict, originating with the advent of private property and continuing through struggles over the means of production, from land to factories. This conflict is expected to resolve with the establishment of socialism and communism, and in effect, the end of history and the end of class struggle. For socialism to succeed, workers must seize control of the state and utilize it to fulfill their objectives. This raises a critical question for Marx and his followers. How does this occur? Marx could be interpreted as suggesting that history is deterministic, governed by developmental laws. If, as Marx suggests, exploitation will intensify, then it will inevitably culminate in a revolution. Marx contends that capitalism, ultimately, creates its own gravediggers, referring to the industrial working class, or proletariat. However, the timing of this revolution remains uncertain. Marx was critical of utopian socialists and refrained from making specific predictions, often being vague about when the revolution might occur, sometimes suggesting it was imminent and other times indicating it was far off. He never specified a timeline. Assuming a revolution does take place, what kind of society would emerge? Again, Marx was not explicit, as he did not wish to be labelled as utopian. He indicated that society would transition from capitalism through to socialism to communism, initiated by a revolution, followed by what he termed the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat refers to the period when workers, or their representatives, take control of the state, which had previously been wielded against them. They would then use the state to counter their adversaries. Marx believed this would be a temporary phase. Over time, as opposition to socialism was eliminated or silenced, the need for this dictatorship would diminish, leading to a more harmonious society, where everyone's needs are met, ultimately resulting in the emergence of communism and the dissolution of the dictatorship. Marx provides little clarity on what a future society might entail. He envisions a world without a police force or similar institutions, suggesting a withering away of the state, while people, using technology, live self-sufficient lives, developing a spectrum of skills. He also asserted that in the future, property, or private property, would not exist. This implies a society characterized by shared equality. Marxists and socialists have since had to grapple with uncertainty regarding their objectives. They seem to believe that a new society will materialize, yet lack a clear plan for achieving that goal. This is illustrated before the Russian Revolution in the Menshevik-Bolshevik debate. The Mensheviks believing in incremental progress towards revolution through education and agitation. The Bolsheviks organized rebellion. Although Marx offers a thorough critique of capitalism, he provides scant guidance on transitioning from capitalism to socialism or communism. He assumes that workers, or the proletariat, will develop a revolutionary consciousness, recognizing that capitalism is irreformable and must be dismantled. This has led to an ongoing disputes from the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks onwards regarding whether to stick or twist. Following Marx's death in 1883, the absence of a revolution raised a critical question for socialists and Marxists. Why had a revolution not yet occurred? While they hoped one would eventually arise, they sought explanations for this period of stagnation, drawing parallels to the early Christians who had adapted their ideology to accommodate the non-return of Christ. Several explanations emerged during this period. Engels argued that governments had gained significantly more power than in the past, capable of inflicting greater harm. Today, protests can lead to severe violence against workers due to advanced weaponry. Thus, merely taking to the streets to incite a revolution is unlikely to succeed. This is evident today, as the means of repression have become increasingly lethal and sophisticated, as have the means of surveillance. In the years after Marx's death, a reformist socialism began to take shape. A key example is found in Britain, where socialism evolved from trades unions and later the Labour Party, which was formed by the trades unions. This reform-oriented socialism suggests that rather than pursuing a revolution, the focus should be on enhancing everyday life for individuals, such as improving working conditions, ensuring fair wages, and providing decent housing. Sometimes referred to as welfare socialism, this approach emphasizes rights and protections, aligning it with modern social liberalism. The question then arises, is a welfare society an end in itself, or merely a stage in the incremental progression towards a complete restructuring of the state and economy. The idea of complete transformation as being the final objective is enshrined in the original Clause 4 of the Labour Party's constitution, which set the ultimate objective of the Labour Party in the far future as the complete public ownership of all means of production, distribution, and exchange, i.e., taking over the whole economy. However, welfare socialism was problematic for many socialists, since by aiming to secure better conditions in the short term, or indeed as a long-term aim, such as limiting the workday to 8 hours and improving workplaces, this might undermine the processes by which alienation propels the proletariat towards revolution. However, reformism became a significant aspect of the socialist movement, prioritizing gradual change through political means and the democratic process. This produced democratic socialism, social democracy, and later on the so-called third way socialism, which saw the reconciliation of welfare and capitalism as an end in itself. From this perspective, capitalism produces the wealth, and left-wing governments would see that it's used to promote social justice, which is a far cry from the complete transformation of the state, and saw its expression in Blair's New Labour project, although for much of its history, the Labour Party has been dominated by the ideas of social democracy, rather than revolutionary socialism. In Russia, it was the Bolsheviks who led the revolution that established the world's first socialist state, which presented another problem for socialism. Why had a revolution not occurred in the most advanced capitalist states? Marx believed that socialism and communism would arise from the growth of capitalism, predicting revolutions in the most developed capitalist countries, such as Germany, France, and Britain. However, this did not materialize. Instead, revolutions occurred in backward, semi-feudal states, such as Russia and China. Socialists proposed various explanations. Lenin and others introduced the theory of imperialism. Lenin's theory of imperialism emerged during the late 19th century and before the First World War, a period marked by European expansion and the quest for dominance, particularly in Africa and South Asia. His theory proposed that while capitalism is inherently exploitative, the most severe exploitation occurs within the empires established by the imperialist nations. The peoples of China, Africa, and other regions faced the harshest oppression. In this analysis, the proletariat of industrial nations had been pacified by the wealth derived from colonial plunder. Colonialism also appealed to the nationalism of people in industrial countries, promoting notions of cultural and racial superiority. No worker, regardless of their plight, could feel inferior to those who lived in the colonies. Ultimately, the working classes in Britain, France, and Germany benefited from this exploitation, experiencing less severe oppression due to the wealth generated by their empires. Working people across Britain, France, and Germany took pride in the notion of their empires they would never visit, but only saw as marks on a map and waved flags on certain commemorative days. This understanding led Lenin to argue that revolutions were unlikely to occur where Marx had anticipated, in Western Europe. Instead, they would arise in regions like Russia, China, and Africa, where exploitation and alienation was most acutely felt. Additionally, Lenin sought to comprehend why workers were not rising up as Marx had predicted. He observed that many workers were inclined toward reform rather than revolution, influenced by the experiences of reformist socialism. To inspire revolutionary thought, Lenin believed that the solution lay in establishing a revolutionary party led by dedicated revolutionaries. This party would operate clandestinely, employing illegal tactics and violence if necessary. This revolutionary vanguard would strategize, plan, and execute the revolution, subsequently focusing on enlightening the proletariat. Workers on their own would only develop what Lenin termed trade union consciousness, concentrating solely on improving wages and reducing working hours, while remaining exploited by the capitalist class. This concept bears resemblance to Babeuf's aspirations with the conspiracy of equals in the late 18th century, which is why comparisons between him and Lenin are often made. When the First World War erupted in 1914, most European socialist parties supported their national efforts. However, Lenin and the Bolshevik Party did not. They viewed the war as an imperialist conflict among powerful nations, with the working class as the primary victims. From the outset, the Bolsheviks regarded the war as an imperialist struggle, predicting disastrous consequences for the involved countries. They recognized it, though, as an opportunity for themselves amid the chaos. During the First World War, in the opening stages, Lenin and his associates were in exile in Switzerland and largely unknown in Russia. In 1917, the Germans astutely recognized the impending collapse of Russia and decided to send Lenin and his comrades back to Russia on a train, aiming to facilitate a revolution there. And they succeeded. Upon their return to a disintegrating Russia, Lenin and his group led the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Socialists worldwide were unfamiliar with Lenin and Trotsky, but were elated as a successful socialist revolution had finally emerged. Socialists from around the globe travelled to Moscow and St. Petersburg to celebrate what they believed was the birth of a new communist society, often referred to as the New Jerusalem. However, the introduction of the dictatorship of the proletariat by the Bolsheviks and Lenin led to debate and disillusionment in response to its brutality, including the immediate suppression of the press and the execution of opposition figures. The Red Army was deployed to quell protesters. Many enthusiastic leftists who travelled to Russia to help build this society ended up imprisoned, executed, or exiled. Some socialists argued that violence would be temporary, yet it soon became evident that the dictatorship would not dissolve easily, with ongoing justifications for its existence. After Lenin fell ill and eventually died, a power struggle ensued over leadership, with Trotsky expected to take charge. But Stalin ultimately seized control and solidified a permanent dictatorship, transforming the Soviet Union into what many considered a vast prison. The Marxists labelled the reformists as social fascists, deepening the divide. This split marked a significant moment in the global socialist movement, which remains bitterly divided today, with revolutionary socialists seeing reformist socialists as effectively propping up the capitalist order. During the mid-20th century, before and after the Second World War, global socialism appeared to be gaining momentum, which coincided with the Cold War, during which the United States was committed to preventing the spread of socialism through a policy of containment, exemplified by the Vietnam War, which aimed at halting the so-called domino effect of socialism, which seemed to be moving across Southeast Asia. Many believed this situation would endure for a long time. However, over time, it became increasingly clear that the Soviet bloc was not only repressive, with restrictions on free press and elections, but also economically highly inefficient. While people in Western Europe, during the decades after the Second World War, particularly West Germany, were becoming increasingly prosperous, those in the Soviet bloc were not. This economic disparity and widening gap between the West and the East led to the construction of the Berlin Wall, which was intended to prevent the citizens of East Germany fleeing to the affluent West. Over time, the situation for the Soviet bloc deteriorated. The turning point came in 1989, when, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union itself fell apart, with countries in Eastern Europe like the Czech Republic and Poland undergoing significant transformations and rejecting their communist Marxist-led governments. In just 3 or 4 years, a structure that had taken many years to build and represented socialism and communism disintegrated, marking the end of that system. Simultaneously, Western Europe was facing its own challenges, as social democratic reformist parties struggled. The systems they had established, largely supported by high taxes and social welfare and education, were seen as no longer functioning efficiently. In an era of stagflation, slow growth, and unemployment, the post-war consensus, which had united parties of the centre-left and centre-right, began to fall apart. This was highlighted by the rise of politicians such as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They championed a strong pro-capitalist society, largely in response to the perceived failures of social democracy and reformist socialism. It also led to the emergence of an ideology of neoliberalism. This situation contributed to the collapse of both Marxist communist model in the Soviet Union and reformist socialism in Western Europe. By the late 1980s and into the following decade, many argued that socialism was finished. Francis Fukuyama, among others, claimed that liberal capitalism had triumphed and history had come to an end, and suggested that socialism would not return and that everyone would enjoy greater wealth under the new system. Since the 1980s, globalization and neoliberal markets dominated politics, with even the parties of the left reconciling themselves to market forces, such as third-way socialism, Blairism, New Labour, privatisation and deregulation became normalised and seen as common sense. However, it has, over the last few decades, failed in its own terms to deliver. Damage to the environment, wider and wider gaps between those who have and those who have not, social inequality and persistent unemployment and periods of economic turbulence such as 2008 with the banking crisis, and various fluctuations in capitalism show that it's a highly unstable system that doesn't deliver economic prosperity for all and certainly not equally. The anticipated liberation associated with liberal capitalism and globalization have not become a reality. As a result, socialism has experienced a resurgence. However, so have the politics of populism and the far right. From a socialist perspective, the critiques of globalization argue that it does not, as it suggested, make everyone wealthier and is simply a broad global system for widespread exploitation of resources and people in those countries with few resources or resources and little else. Certainly in areas of the world like Africa, the gap between developed countries and developing countries widened in life expectations and wealth. In many areas of the world, workers worked in sweatshops, producing cheap goods for the consumer societies of the West, while their resources were mined and stolen by global multinational companies. Therefore, the criticism of globalization and neoliberalism pointed to the increase in not only global poverty, but also environmental destruction. Issues such as climate change and deforestation became issues of the left and were adopted by socialist movements, which merged into the green movements, since both green and left-wing politics saw the aggressive nature of capitalism and the overexploitation of resources as leading to the destruction of the environment. So current forms of socialism have focused on opposing globalization and poverty and environmental destruction, and socialism has re-emerged in the discussions of these issues. Another strand of socialism, and a major development, occurred just before and after the Second World War and has continued in the latter part of the 20th century. This form of socialism is cultural socialism, or analysis of capitalism and its effect on culture and its relationship with culture. It was a shift away from the fundamental idea of Marx that economics was the foundation of all social and economic change. Instead, culture was highlighted in itself. These neo-Marxists, as they are called, such as Antonio Gramsci, who lived in Italy and spent much of his life in prison in Italy before the Second World War, introduced the idea of common sense, which Gramsci termed a hegemony, which supports the idea of capitalism rather than being the result of capitalism. That capitalism was not so much an economic system as a system of ideas and beliefs has led a whole new line of inquiry for socialists. Dominant cultural beliefs, or hegemonic beliefs, such as a belief that hard work leads to improvement for everyone, or that markets are always the most efficient form of organization, or that wealth inequality is natural, underpin capitalism and are generated independently of economic structures. Neo-Marxists, such as the Frankfurt School of Academics, continued Gramsci's exploration of culture, focusing on the culture industry, media, advertising, and popular culture in order to understand how capitalism is sustained and the revolution deferred. From this perspective, to enact societal change, we must shift the prevailing pro-capitalist mindset. This strategy can be seen in movements advocating rights, such as those for gay rights. The so-called culture wars often stem from the belief that societal progress hinges on changing people's thoughts in various ways. So while socialism has fragmented and the old debates continue, it remains significant and continues to attract many supporters, with this trend likely to persist in the future as long as human organization appears to some of us deeply unjust and in need of change, with the belief that there must be something better over the horizon. Thank you for listening to the Politics Shed podcast. Please refer to the Politics Shed website for resources and information and much else.